morning, everyone. Welcome to the lecture series held by International Institute of Study for Nomadic Civilizations under auspices of UNESCO. And today we're very honored to have Dr. Francesca Fiaschetti from the University of Vienna. And she is currently the director of Mongolian cluster at the Department of Religious Studies. And our lecture will be titled Studying the History of Mongolia, Methods and Challenges. So today we have probably an hour for our whole presentation and discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put it up forward and we will have room for discussion. And okay, let's get started. And my whole heart of gratitude for Francesca and everybody attending today. So now the room is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak at your lecture series and for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So today I have been asked to explain to non-historian what are the issues we are confronted with when we study the history of Mongolia. What I'm going to do is to give a very general presentation of some of the challenges and the developments in scholarship through my own experience and my own studies. And I will end up with a case study from my own actual research of the moment. When we study the history of Mongolia, there are several questions that we have to understand at the beginning. What region are we talking about? What are the languages that we deal with? And where is our data? Where are the materials and the methods used? Mainly is we work with across many fields and many disciplines. We start with defining the region, and there are many possibilities about defining the region where Mongolia belongs to. It has been a recent current debate, especially in Europe, about defining the field that belongs to the study of the Central Asian region, including Mongolia. Some of the most recent publications have addressed this question looking at the historical development of the concept and terms for Central Asia, and most recently, a European Handbook of Central Asian Studies has been published that provides some theoretical framework to understand what we talk about when we talk about Central Asia. And here I propose an excerpt from this book where you can see there are many ways of defining the region and many terms for it according to chronology, to the subject, the matter that we are studying, which can be culture, religion, and some of these definitions apply also to Mongolia and to the communities that lived in Mongolia and shaped its history. And some of the definitions, specifically the one of Central Asia Plus, is particularly relevant for this institute as it focuses on the nomadic sedentary symbiosis and on the peculiarities of the regions where this nomadic community resided and moved. So Mongolia can be considered a part of Central Asia and belong to Central Asian studies as a field of study. There are other ways of defining the region. The most important, the most famous one is the idea of Inner Asia that was formulated by Dennis Sinor in the Cambridge History of Early Inner Asia as the region that you see traced in this map, a series of territories in Northeast Asia and Central Asia that are shaped and defined in contrast to the agricultural civilization around them. Inner Asia is a term that is commonly used also by historians, by us specifically when we deal with the interaction with East Asia, in the case, for example, of the Qing dynasty. So it's the term that Qing historians of the New Qing history have used to look at the Qing moment beyond the legacy of Chinese empires, right? To see the Eurasian and multicultural context of this kind of empires. And then, because Europe has many traditions and many languages, there is also a notable French definition of hotels, Upper Asia, that specifically refers to Tibet and Mongolia. And this is also another trend in European scholarship to associate the study of Mongolia with the study of Tibet. What are the consequences of looking at the region, at the region in terms of micro-regions? The first issue that we are confronted with when we are students of Mongolian history is the issue of languages, sources, and the narratives that they convey. So traditional scholarship before the second half of the 20th, the end of the 20th century, so before the 90s, more or less, focused on using these written sources that we have from the empires to which Mongolia belonged throughout history, right? So specifically, as I was trained as a sinologist, Chinese sources. This, but in the case of the Mongol Empire, there are other Persian sources, Latin Christian sources, right? Because these are the written records that we have about Mongolia, and because Mongolian sources in Mongolia are relatively scarce, especially for the period that I studied, the Mongol Empire, there is a bias in these sources. They are written by foreigners, with the narrative of foreigners. A trend in traditional scholarship was to look at this region as a frontier, as a periphery, in regard to the centers that were the political centers, right, the empires. This is the old trend. What we have been trained with is the new trend. A shifting methodology happens in the 90s with the appearance of the New Jing History School that was initiated. We take as the beginning, well, it was an intellectual movement, right? As historians like to have temporal coordinates, we take as the beginning, as one of the main moments to establish this school, the presidential address by Evelyn Roski, 1996, who specifically addressed the study of the Manchu Qing dynasty by revisiting the whole idea of the Sinicization theory. So by looking at the multicultural contribution of these empires that were Eurasian empires as much as Eurasian empires and were multicultural, they used multiple languages, vis-a-vis the traditional vision of these ruling elites, these empires being assimilated in the Chinese way of empires, and that comes from Chinese historiography, that comes from the main sources that we have. So what the New Jing history promotes is to look at these multicultural empires by looking at the languages that their elite spoke and wrote, Manchu or Mongolian, and by looking at all the other languages and cultural elements of the empires, right? Their social history, material culture, art, not only the state-sponsored historiography. Therefore, after the teaching of the New Jing history and some relevant exponents of these schools are Evelyn Roski, Pamela Crossley, Mark Elliott, but it has been a movement that has been going on. So many scholars have added to this debate. We look at these empires as Eurasian empires. So the big innovation is to use this term Eurasian for periods that are before the late modern period, also medieval period, because it gives the dimension, right, of this empire that encompassed many regions and many cultures. During my PhD studies at Munich University, I have had the luck to work With these scholars of the New Qing history, we held 2 conferences and produced 2 volumes that contributes to this debate. With comparative study of all of what we call the non-Han empires that are these inner Asian states that ruled across East Asia, Northeast Asia, and Inner Asia. As I am a specialist of the Mongol Empire, we have the same trend also in the study of the Mongol Empire, and the main scholar who initiated this renovation in the way how we think about the Mongol Empire is Thomas Olsen, who was the first one to promote a holistic perspective to the Mongol Empire, which means looking at sources in various languages and compare the materials that we have for all the various regions and the various khanates of the Mongol Empire. This is a necessity for us because our sources in Mongolian are very scarce, in Middle Mongolian are very scarce for this period. But by comparing the sources, we can understand what was the unifying factor, also in linguistic terms, in cultural terms, in political terms, that the Mongol elite contributed in creating a Eurasian empire, right? So you will find Chinese and Persian sources and Latin sources, the transliteration or the rendering in foreign languages of Mongolian terms that can be understood only by studying Mongolian culture, right? Chingisid policies and so on were all translated in these languages, and the unity of this can be only understood when we compare the various sources. The other added value of comparing the sources, the big change in the narrative, in the scholarly narrative, is that we start to look at the Mongol Empire and the Mongol elite as a vector of cultural exchange, and not only in the narrative of the submitted people as these foreigners who arrived and destroyed everything, right? So the scholarly trend is to look at all these dimensions of history that show the cultural exchange and the contribution of the Mongol moment as a part of world and global history. And this has been my work after the PhD. There are various centers in the world that propose this approach. During my research, I have had the possibility to work with an international group of scholars from the Middle East, from Europe, and from the US. And we have organized a series of projects, conferences, mainly, and conference proceedings that were a further development of this approach. Basically, the idea is that to study the Mongol Empire, you need to know many languages, and no one knows all of the languages. So the way how we do it is by working together and bringing together specialists of the various khanates and discussing together. That's what the Mongol Empire Spring Series that we have started with a few colleagues have been going on, and here you have 3 examples of these meetings and how they contributed to furthering the study of the Mongol Empire. There is also an effort generally in scholarship to have a revisitation of the history of the Mongol Empire, to produce encyclopedic works that are collaborative works, right? And here you have a few examples. The most recent is the Cambridge History of the Mongol Empire. That is relevant because it is made by 2 volumes, and 1 volume is specifically devoted to all the sources in the various languages, describing all the sources available in the various languages, right? And the contribution in general of these cooperative works is that there is a tendency to include more and more scholars also from the region, and whenever there is the chance to include also Mongolian scholars, right? So that's an important trend that makes us understanding of the Mongol Empire much better. Now, because we deal with so many sources, the main difference that I found in working about the history of Mongolia compared to anthropologists and social historians is where do we find archives and what are the institutions where we can study the history of Mongolia. It's not a subject like sociology or geography that you can find at every university. There are specialized centers, and where these centers are is related to the history of Mongolian relations with Europe, with the US, and with the Asian countries. So I am going to present here a very small overview that relates mainly to Europe and to my own experience. As a history of the Mongol Empire, I had to nomadize between centers and institutes, and that's what I could gather, right? So the archives are, as archives, we intend libraries, museums, collections. So our work is always with sources of various types, and we have many archives spread outside of Mongolia. Roughly, we can define the way how these documents and these sources arrived to the West through various moments, specifically diplomatic exchange during the 13th and 14th century. So we have several documents. One notable example that you have all been acquainted with last year during the visit of the Pope is the Vatican archives that collect some diplomatic correspondence. But there are various letters of the Ilkhanates in libraries across Europe, in France, and we have even a copy in Vienna. So the information about Mongolia, specifically ethnographic information from a Western perspective, is also related to the Jesuits and their travels to East Asia between the 16th and 18th century, and their engagement with and service for these Indonesian empires, most notably the Qing dynasty, that brought them in contact with the communities and with the regions of Indonesia. And then we have collections related to the travels of explorers, researchers, scholars who in the 19th and 20th century made scholarly fieldwork explorations across Central Asia. The most here you have a sample, a small sample. One scholar I have been engaging with particularly is Alexander von Humboldt, who was one of the main scholars to introduce the concept of Central Asia to the Western world in his work Asia Central. And here you see that the issue of dealing with these regions is also defining the parameters, defining how and why we talk about this region. Humboldt's definition is a pure geographical one. There are other expeditions that were interested in the Silk Road's framework, right? So commercial, religious exchanges. And that's also the quality of our data and our collections, right? So scholars look at various aspects of the culture, at languages, we have dictionaries, or at the physical, physical geographical characteristics of the regions. So we all agree that this region has some peculiarities that are important to study in comparative perspective. It's just that each tradition is interested in a different aspect. And here you have, well, just example of the names that are most relevant that you need to know when dealing with Mongolian studies. Isaac Jacob Schmidt, the first Mongolist. So one or two examples of these scholars in the 19th and 20th century brought the first knowledge and the first attempt to a scholarly study or to a systematization of the study of the languages and cultures of Mongolia, right? Another famous one is Kovalevsky, who wrote the first French-Russian-Mongolian dictionary. And to these people, we should add the Mongolian citizens who came to Europe, who went abroad to study. And here you have three important movements that we have studied in recent articles that I've been writing with a colleague of the National University, Dr. Jadamba, about Mongolian migration in Europe, right? There are the relation of Mongolia with other countries have different developments, right? So some countries have a longer tradition of exchanges, also exchanges in students and demographic exchanges. And then after the 90s, there was this opening to the world and the more consistent migration, the demographic exchange between Mongolia and Europe and other countries. So according to more recent data, especially the Mongolian census of 2020, you can see where is the most of Mongolian population abroad residing. And the characteristics of the Mongolian diaspora are interesting because it's a relatively new phenomenon, it's short-term migration, and there is a huge percentage of return migration. So Mongolians who move to other countries are mainly for studying and also for work, right? Why there is this difference in the places where they move, where Mongolian students and workers move to, is because of these historical relations, right? So you have the countries in yellow that have historical relations with Mongolian before the socialist period, and then after the 50s, Central and Eastern Europe developed very much. And after the 90s, you have the appearance of Mongolian diaspora in other countries. And this is relevant because the establishment of these diplomatic relations and the movement of populations meant that people could move to Mongolia and they could learn the language, right? So the way how scholarly centers and universities have been changed by these diplomatic relations and by these demographic developments is that we start to have centers for the study of Mongolian studies, but mostly also of the language across Europe. And again, I am giving a perspective of Europe because this is what I know, but obviously there are many other studies that address these issues also relating to the US and the other parts of Asia, right? There are Mongolian studies across the world nowadays. But this is a little bit an overview of how it came to be in Europe. And I will give you some examples that are closely related to my experience. I have been trained mainly in Central Europe. And here the tradition has been established by Walter Heisig, who studied across various countries, and he was the chair of the Mongolian studies at Bonn University, that I guess you all know. And Alexander Bischoff, So there are a lot of exchanges between Austria and Germany in terms of Mongolian studies scholarship. Bishop is relevant because he was the one who taught classical Mongolian language at the University of Vienna before the establishment of the Mongolia cluster, right? So it's the person we all look at when talking about Mongolian studies at the University of Vienna. So that's replies to your question. And he was a scholar of Indology, Sinology, and Tibetology. So you see again this recurring issue of looking at Mongolia as part of a macro region, right? And he was an expert in Buddhist studies. So that's what the tradition that he established brings forth in the University of Vienna. And because I am Italian, I have to mention also Italy. So fortunately, in the past few years, there has been an attempt to centralize information about the creation of Mongolian studies centers abroad. And a colleague from the University of Rome made the point about Italian scholarship and the main centers that historically have brought Mongolian language, the teaching of Mongolian language, and then the cultures related to it, to Italy, with the Collegio Asiatico in Naples, the Istituto di Studi Superiori in Florence. In Venice, as you all know, there is a big tradition, mainly related to studies about Marco Polo that then developed into more specialized studies on Mongolia and the Mongol Empire. And at my own university, we had, among others, Igor Derakhevitz, whom you will know for his translation and the edition of The Secret History of the Mongols. So he's the scholar who standardized the way how we look and study and reference the secret history of the Mongols, right? There are other centers, especially in Eastern Europe, that are more focused on linguistic issues, literature, and dictionaries, right? So be aware that this is just the bit of Europe that made my that informed me as a scholar. Okay. And now, now that you have seen all the people that shaped me, I am going to show you how I talk about Mongolian history. At the moment, my current project is about the 14th century. You have seen that there are a lot of publications about the beginning of the Mongol Empire, the 13th century, but now we all look at the 14th century as this moment where what the Mongol conquest initiated was brought to a new dimension. I specifically work on the mid-Yuan period, on the Yuan dynasty and the mid-Yuan period, by looking at intellectual and religious elites and what they produced. And when we talk about the mid-Yuan period, that is basically the period after after Kublai, starting with Toktemur, right, in the 1330s, more or less, 1320s. We have one very big academy that is called the Guizhangge, the Pavilion of the Star of Literature, that was founded in 1329. So you see the advantage of looking at cultural history is that when we address Median China, the common narrative is that this period after Kublai, where the state was fragmented and everybody was fighting with everybody, right? But in fact, there was a legacy that was brought forth of these big intellectual projects that started in the 13th century and that happened also in the 14th century. So this is an academy, a kind of academy of sciences, as you have here, who was established specifically to collect political literature that would help the emperors understand how to maintain the favor of Tengri and be a good ruler, basically. So we have everything from historiographical works to mirror footprints is religious works, and it's not only text. There is also a lot of art and a lot of calligraphy going on. This academy produced some important works like the Jingshidadian, the Compendium for Governing the World, which is the most important UN source that we have from the period. Again, fragmented, but we are getting there to reconstruct the entire work. And it talks about all of aspects of UN government. And although, despite this a Chinese source, it was compiled directly under the auspices of a Mongol emperor. So it is a way of portraying the Mongol view on government and the affairs of the state. The people who worked in this academy under the Jingshidadian were many from various backgrounds. We had Central Asian, Han Chinese, scholars of Middle Eastern origin, and they had various faiths. So we have Buddhist monks, we have Confucian scholars, Nestorian Christian scholars. They all worked together for the emperor, but they also communicated together, and we have a lot of, we have very many examples of everyday cultural translation, right? So the building of networks, personal networks, and how it plays in the individual life of people. People taking Buddhist names or taking multiple names, writing in various formats to each other, not only for the emperor. So this is the center that this academy brings us the most, an array of very important documents for the 14th century that testifies to these multicultural and multi-religious networks working for the Mongolian emperors in China that spread across Eurasia. And as you see, they were not only writing and translating, they were also making music and playing football when they had the occasion, right? So the 14th century is the moment when this Eurasian culture that scholars have been talking about and showing from state-sponsored sources arrives in the everyday life of people and in the material culture and in the narratives of people. And through individuals travels across Eurasia, and there have been several studies here. I put just some relevant ones to show you how we need to work interdisciplinary, right? Understanding the Mongol Empire is not only the work of philologists and archaeologists. We can understand the impact of the Mongol moment by looking at material culture, commodities, pearls, the travels of technology, like the distillation technology, and of medicines and all things related to medicine, spices, text, food, cuisine, and knowledge around that, right? What I have been focusing on is a book I am working on together with a colleague, Francesca Fiaschetti, who is a specialist of Iranian studies. So as you've seen, I have been mentioning many colleagues with whom I work with because we cannot study Mongolia or the Mongol Empire alone. We need to talk to various scholars in various fields and with knowledge of various languages. In the book that we are currently working on, we look at Rashid al-Din's History of China, and I hope that everybody knows Rashid al-Din. He's a scholar working for the Ilkhanate in the 14th century and the author of one of the most famous universal histories that was produced in this period, the Compendium of Chronicles, that includes also a history of China due to the important relations between the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty during the period, right? So there was a lot of knowledge moving from China to the Middle East, so much so that people wanted to know the history of China. We have been working at a commented English translation, and scholars working around this text have found similarities with Chinese text that is also 14th century text, slightly later, which is the Fuzuli-Daitongzai, the comprehensive record of Buddha and the patriarchs through the ages. So it's a Buddhist history, which again shows you the tendency of the Mongolian emperors towards Buddhism, which had become a kind of common language across various khanates, right? And it was sponsored by various emperors in the Yuan dynasty. The work is a work of a multicultural work per se. It is an analytic work depicting dynasties, but with a Buddhist narrative. And that's, the theory is that because these two texts are so similar, they are almost, there are passages that are almost taken word by word, but in the history of China, ethnonyms, names of persons and toponyms are imported in Persian through the Middle Mongolian transcriptions. We have the hypothesis that there was a Middle Mongolian work in between these two works that is then what arrived in the Ilkhanate. So you see that every time we talk about the Mongol Empire, we have to deal with not only one language, not only one region, but many. And here I give you an example of how cultural translation worked in the 14th century. So the Compendium of Chronicles and the History of China was written under the auspices of Mongol elite, right? So the Mongol rulers had an interest in knowing the history of the world and narrating the history of the world in a way that was the narration of the history of the Mongols as part of the history of the world. That's why the Buddhist narrative was so useful for that. So we have a Mongol audience. We have the author who is Muslim, right? And we have Chinese Buddhist chronicles with traditional Chinese analytic framework. In the description of Buddha's birth in the history of China specifically, we have some elements that combines these cultural frameworks, right? So the importance of Buddha is highlighted in his supernatural birth, which is described with terms that very much resonates with an Islamic audience, with the virginity of the mother, like other prophets and important religious people they knew, but also with metaphors that can remind of Alan Qua and the secret history, right? And these are elements of the author to adapt the subject and to introduce it, not only to the people who are sponsoring the work, but also to the audience to his network and to the audience that will read it, right? And here we see the work of the author himself. So it's not only the state that produces this cultural exchange, it's also the individuals that work for the state that put their own agency in that. And here is Rashiduddin describing Buddha in his own words as a prophet. One of the prophets before the real prophet arrives. And the very interesting discovery that my colleagues and I worked on is the fact that in the history of China, for the first time, Rashiduddin introduced also Confucius and Lao Tzu to a Muslim audience, and Lao Tzu is also mentioned as being a prophet and Confucius not, for obvious reasons that are related to representation of religions in the Mongol Empire. So, concluding, here we have some points that are relevant to the study both of Central Asia and of Mongolian history. There are various regional approaches, meaning various ways of looking at the regions Mongolia and the Mongolian communities belong to, and regional approaches according to the traditions of studies and scholars who promoted the study of Mongolia in the various institutions. Studying the history of Mongolia is always interdisciplinary and always related to sources in various languages and various kinds of sources, not only written sources. And the emergence of many centers, of more and more centers for the study of Mongolia, like the Mongolia cluster, in various countries, testifies to the increasing importance of the field, the relevance of Mongolia and knowing Mongolia for the community of scholars across the globe, across the world, and the importance of studying Mongolian history as an exercise, as a kind of field work to exercise comparative and work history. This has been addressed in the words of Beckwith in the case of Central Asia, but if you substitute Central Asia with Mongolia, you will have the same result, the same important result. And this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now for discussion and for question and answering, maybe let's quickly check if there is any online questions from our cyber audience. Questions. Okay. So, okay, will there be any questions from our attending friends? So you're very welcome to put forward and have a small discussion, and we are still doing okay with time. Please go ahead and raise your hand.
Sorry for missing the first part of the lecture. So, when you say the conclusion, well, I can see a little bit of a trend going on, especially for books such as Mongolia, as well as that states on the typology of Nomadic.
Yes.
Etc. So the first question relates to that. Can you see what the scholars picking out?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So the second is related. Because of geopolitical situations, etc., Mongolia is always classified not only from within, but from outside as part of other regions still at this moment, right? For example, and the US foreign policy were started being classified into China, right? Because the whole focus is China, right? And because of that, Mongolia is classified. It's kind of a part of Indo-Pacific sphere. So, but it was quite different 10 years ago. So you see those kind of changes in Europe that could relate to classification of Mongolia as some part of Central Asia or any other such as that, and its implications on Europe.
Right. Yes. So thank you for the questions. The first, regarding the first question, yes, the works that you mentioned are really, really important, not only for social anthropology, but also for historians as we, in regards to the terms that we use, right? So it challenges us to talk about political structures in history by, not by adopting the common terms and frameworks that have been used for other states or other polities, but by looking at the unique elements of the political framework of in the Asian polities and especially the Mongols, right? So for us, it's really an exercise in awareness of how we can bring the uniqueness of the Mongolian political philosophy, the way of thinking, the structures, in a language that respects where these structures come from, and not just using labels, putting labels that are used for other polities. So yes, we all had to read Smith and Monjardene, and it was eye-opening for us. So it was a good contribution. Regarding the regional theorization, I think, as I explained in the beginning, it's really important and relevant, the debate that is going on in recent years, very recent years, about how to theorize Central Asia. Again, the words that we use are always depend to the audience and to the aim, right? So for matters of classifications in geopolitical terms or international relations or cooperations, Mongolia in Europe, I'm talking about institutional programs, cooperations, scholarships, projects, right, is part of the Central Asian region. So that's, but if you look at the disciplines, at the scholarly environment, the way how the study of Mongolia is approached, that changes. Again, according to what we are looking for. So, for example, Bishop that I have showed, he was teaching at the Tibetology department. So there is this tendency of connecting Mongolia and Tibet because of the religious tradition, religious and cultural tradition. What we're trying to do with the Mongolia cluster is to break out of these frameworks and define Mongolia as a place where various disciplines can contribute, right? So there is an effort, a recent effort by institutions to define Mongolia and Mongolian studies as a unique field of study, as but it is very new, and it is a work in progress that is related also to our possibilities to interact with Mongolia and with Mongolian institutions and prepare the right framework for the study of Mongolia as a single subject, right? So that's for sure something we will have to work on in the future.
Any other questions? We still have some time left.
Ja.
Wie ist diese Mongolia-Cluster
Entstanden.
wie ist sie entstanden und wie entwickelt sie sich
Okay.
in der Zukunft?
Okay.
Vielleicht in Wien gibt es auch eine Sektion Touristik oder sowas. Vielleicht.
Well, we all hope for it. So the question is regarding the Mongolia cluster that was established 5 years ago, more or less, and it was established by a grant of the Ministry of Education here. So it's sponsored by the Mongolian, it was sponsored by the Mongolian Ministry of Education in the effort of bringing the presence of Mongolian studies to more regions, right? It is an ongoing effort. There are several centers that have been created. The reason was this. So the initial proposal was this. We have many scholars working on various things Mongolia related. We have a strong representation of studies about the Mongol Empire between the university and the Academy of Science. We have we have a department for the study of Eastern European history that also focuses on Central Asia. We have the Tibetology and Religious Studies department. We have Asian Studies department and the Art History department. So the idea was, in Vienna, many of us were dealing with Mongolian history and Mongolian culture, and we were all talking to each other, but we didn't have a place to display this unity of interest to the students and to the general public, right? So exactly like this is a knowledge hub, the Mongolia cluster was created to be a knowledge hub about for all the various people interested as a hobby or professionally in the study of various things Mongolian, right? And that's why it is an effort that sees the cooperation of various institutes and various institutions as well. And we have been, well, mainly teaching history because I am a historian and I was working at the history department before. And many colleagues are historians as well, right? But we have had cooperations with political studies department, religious studies department. Um, our aim, one issue that is crucial for scholarship, for the future scholarship is because we deal more and more with Mongolian, we want to bring the voice of Mongolian in the past and in the present to the field. We wanted to establish teaching of classical Mongolian at least to understand the historical sources. And this is what has been the most successful effort of the Mongolia cluster so far. We have 2 teachers providing online courses of classical Mongolian worldwide. And we are very happy about that because what, what is necessary is a place of encounter to think how to bring Mongolian studies in the scholarly community, right? And we needed also a place that could continuously offer teaching to students because the students of the University of Vienna and international students as well needed to be trained to understand the region, to understand the peculiarity of the region, the main concepts being shamanism or Tibetan Buddhism or whatever, right? So that's really the groundwork that the Mongolia cluster has been doing together with the various institutions that offer other platforms like conferences and for scholarly exchange, right? We do hope that it will bring a more consistent representation of Mongolian studies at the university. That's definitely an aim for the future.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, then I'm going to introduce my priority as a moderator.
Yes.
And I have 2 questions for you. And the first is related to the last one, which is about the Mongolian cluster you're working at. So I'm wondering, so as you said, like Mongolian studies is always multidisciplinary and there are scholars from different identities. So I'm wondering, as a like study center, which is based in Europe. So I'm wondering, how do you deal with like a micro knowledge hierarchy in like daily cooperation with your colleagues? So some people, they may have like better experience in the international academia and they might have like higher visibility and stronger voice. Let's say maybe theoretically or um, theoretically or yeah, let's say theoretically, like they have better visibility in the international opinion, but also some other scholars, they may have stronger access to local knowledge, to like historical archives based on their language skills. So there are still like micro hierarchy, like according to their specialties and expertises. And so I'm wondering, how do you deal with that in your like daily work? And the second question is, so, well, I'm an anthropologist, and this is the question that anthropologists are constantly confronted with, which is in a contemporary world where politics, identity have been so overwhelming, and there are so many burning issues happening, and why are we still looking at something that sounds a little bit old and ancient and dusty? So what's very often commented in your question, like what is the point of this research? And especially which is as a Chinese scholar who is doing research about Central Asia or even like wider region, like outside of China. And this is also very Chinese mentality, like you're always asking for the practical significance of the research. So I'm wondering, as a historian, what would you say is like significance of looking at the historical Mongol Empire in the time where the notion of Eurasia, of like Central Asia as a geographical or social entity seems to be getting further away, and especially this identity gap between Europe and Asia seems to be getting deeper and deeper if we think about the voices over there during Ukraine-Russian war. That's how Asia is kind of depicted as the barbarian root of Russia, and Europe is depicted as a civilized or socially advanced picture. So I'm wondering, what would you say as a historian about like the significance of historical work of Mongolia?
Yeah, that exactly in this formulation lies the significance of being an historian and teaching history, exactly to go beyond this paradigm, right? I personally, in my professional work, don't see at all this distance between this increasing distance between Europe and Asia in the context of Eurasia. On the contrary, right? The examples that you brought shows how much whatever happens at one corner of Eurasia influences the other regions in the other corner of Eurasia, right? So it's very much the proof that we are interconnected, and also it brings us to question the identity and the shaping of our communities, right? To put it simply, to reply to your two questions, first, the hierarchy. In my experience, and I am lucky in that I have found a lot of solidarity among scholars of Mongolian history and of the Mongol Empire, specifically because it's such a hard field to portray, to teach, to explain. We have to work a lot. And because each of us works a lot, we know how difficult it is. I have always found very collegial scholars. We help each other. As you have seen from the examples that I have brought, we cooperate. I really studying Mongolia cannot be done alone, right? And the fact that we have been able to bring forth these projects means that if you create a platform for cooperation, people will talk to each other, right? So that's the beauty of dealing with Mongolia. And I will answer to your other question with an example from my professional experience as a teacher. I have been teaching the Mongol Empire in various countries, right? Occasionally in Italy, in Jerusalem, and now in Austria. And I can also add conferences in Japan and things like that. Wherever I go, I always can find a connection to the history of the Mongol Empire, right? Mongolian armies arrived near the border of the city of Vienna. We have a copy of Ilkhanid letter now in the library, in the National Library. We have Ilkhanid textiles in Vienna. The Battle of Angelut, and the campaigns in Japan. Studying Mongolian history is to study the history of each region that came in contact with the Mongols. I am an Italian and we had Marco Polo, right? Just to put it very simply, there is not a single region and a single audience I have talked to that has not been touched in their history by the experience of the Mongol, right? And because Mongolia is such a relevant player now among the Central Asian states that deal with Europe, we are confronted more and more with this reality that we want to know, exactly like Rashid ad-Din was confronted with the history of China. So the purpose of studying history is very, very simple terms. You cannot understand the nowadays reality from what we talk about if you don't study history. And because the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire, I have the luck of being able to approach each audience with something personal and something close to them, right?
That is a very comforting. You don't have any other questions, let's just bring our deepest gratitude to
Yeah.
Francesca. And thank you also for our online attenders. Thank you very much for today. And I hope you all had a very cheerful experience. So let's bring it to the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.